Hi, welcome to another Language Box talk. My name's Grace Lynch, and this talk is going to be about the story mind. The story mind is an idea I had. It came up in Language Box work because uh, the benefit of Language Box work was that it gave me a way to find and practice an awareness, a location in my own consciousness that uh, was amenable to forming language, but was not already lost in contextualization. So it was a way to experience my consciousness, but outside of any role, any assignation, any outward identity of any kind. And there's a different video I need to do about the practical steps of doing that. It's not a very difficult process, and it just took practice once I found out how to do it. Language Box work gave me the first experience in my life, beginning at the age of 45, of a way to have experience happen and be aware of it and decide what I how I wanted to process it and then express it, but find my words based on what felt safe to me and what made sense to me. And then when I carefully did that in the privacy of my own autistic mind, to gradually learn how to connect that way of language to the ways of language I found in the world around me. Up to that point in my life, I'd always done it the other way around. I'd taken language and language systems from the world and tried to build my inner voice from that. And because of the nature of neurotypical language, or at least neurotypically dominant language, the original language system of the planet, there wasn't enough common experiences in me to match up with that and make that effective. I did not learn until I got diagnosed with autism and I started talking with other autistic people, including my own son, that I actually experience synesthesia. I process any sense as if it was any other sense if I want to. If it makes more sense for me to take in, say, a sunset and explore my awareness of the experience of seeing the sunset and then express it more efficiently as if it were a sound or a taste. I just do that, and I've been doing that since I was born. I also find that there are certain impediments to processing that the social world has. I think it's largely because many times when people process an idea, they process the idea, but they want to make sure they're still touching the ground of all the connecting ideas that they trust. So it makes it they have a lot of baggage to carry and figuring out a way to go from point A to point B. There's emotional connections, cultural connections, relational connections, all of which can really be an impediment to quick processing. I could not form very many social connections, so I never developed the impediment in the first place. In fact, the bulk of my anxiety came from slowly understanding or coming to understand that my language worked differently. My way of processing worked differently. So one of the barriers that I had was that I was trying to use uh, the language systems that I got from the world that never actually jived with my autistic experience. But there were no tools or apparatus to develop my autistic experience into language on my own and then slowly figure out how it could fit into the world around me. The world couldn't give me a language for my autism because the world, the language of the world, the way I see it, it builds itself by establishing collections of little boxes, and it shifts the little boxes around, and this set of meanings that are in little boxes mean a cup, and this set of meanings in the little boxes mean a church, and this set of meanings, and etc. So if a person has roughly the same little boxes of roughly the same size as another person, then they can pretend that they both have the same perception of a word and its functional usage. And out of that gives the illusion of social context if your brain does that. Unfortunately, from my autistic experience, I experience so much perceptual data that I liken it to being born into a blizzard. So it's very difficult for me to parse out, to work through little boxes because I don't have 1,000 little boxes to build my words. Like my detail setting isn't like roughly like other people's. If you imagine the amount of detail the mind perceives as, say, a volume setting on a stereo, most people are born into an orientation to processing perception with their volume setting between, say, 5 and 7. But for reasons that are perhaps due to gestational trauma and certain neurological differences, for me at least, and my understanding is for many other autistic people, it's like being born into a blizzard, a perceptual blizzard, because our volume settings can be set at 5,000 to 7,000 or 5 million to 7 million. So if you imagine the number of little boxes that are required to have an ordinary understanding of what a cup is, say there are 7 little boxes. So a baby learns how to take like the 100 little boxes that they perceive, find the 7 little boxes that become a cup, and when they say the word or put that together relationally with the caregiver or the people around them, they start to put it together in their brain. Their brain puts together that the 7 little boxes mean cup, and the sound comes together because the sound and the action of naming it agrees relationally with other people. When they reflect that back, it sets the language. But unfortunately, for a person who's born into a world where they're not finding the 7 little boxes out of 100, they're finding the 7 little boxes out of 500,000. And those 500,000 are changing all the time. So it makes it more challenging to establish language that way. And the consequence of that is with the inability to decide what a cup is and the functionality of that, because you could have the little pieces, but if you can't put together how to put them together relationally with other people, the language system will still fail. So I could get the little bits together for quite a while, but I started noticing that however encyclopedic my knowledge, my language acquisition was, it didn't result in relationship with my family at all. It resulted actually in a lot of harm. When I got into school, that got worse. I was born into the 60s. Asperger's was not a term until the 90s. By then, I was 30 and had 2 kids of my own. So the world tried its best to give me language systems or paradigms for guidance as to how to participate as a person and a human being in the world around me. From my perception, I took in the rules and did them better than anyone I knew. And when I tried them, it still led to harm. It still led to disrelationship. It still led to conflict. So from my perception, trusting adults to teach me, trusting books to teach me, even though for other people that resulted in success and relationship and friendships and peer groups and stuff, for me, it resulted in further alienation. So that's a really important point. So trying to take in the language systems of the world, every one that I found, I took it in and I demonstrated the rules better than anyone around me. And even so, that created a toxic result for me. And so by the time I was in my middle teens, I was actually afraid of other people. I didn't understand them. Uh, I couldn't trust them to tell me what I needed to know. I didn't trust my parents. I actually thought there was something wrong with them. And because I couldn't trust my parents, I didn't trust teachers or minister people or doctor people or any adults. I didn't actually really understand what an adult was, except for they were less altitudinally challenged than I was. Certain conflicts and abuses happened when I was very little, and I didn't trust other children either because of this. So my life had proceeded, and I got degrees in mathematics and English and eventually computer science. But the struggle was always to find a way to language that worked for me too. Like there were lots of ways that worked for the rest of the world, but none of those worked for me. And then I would have my ways of seeing things and expressing them, but that never worked for the rest of the world. Sometimes if I talked about the raw experience of synesthetic consciousness, I would sound like I'm on an acid trip. In fact, many of those experiences, I took a fall in college when I was 22 years old, and it was the 1980s, and I didn't lose consciousness, but I would learn many years later that in the weeks and a few months that followed that fall, I had sustained a concussion and I experienced expressive aphasia, which is an impedance or sometimes total blocking of the ability to take in language and give it back to the world. And because I didn't understand that I could have possibly sustained a head injury, because in the 80s, if you didn't pass out, it's impossible that you could have seriously hurt yourself. Will Smith's movie Concussion was years away. So I didn't know to ask for help. And I present to the mental, I did, my life was destroyed because my symbolic mind was disrupted. It was harder to process visual symbols, which made even more of a barrier for me with other people because it made reading hard too. Um, and for a long time, the way I expressed myself sounded like mental illness. In fact, it was diagnosed as such, and I was heavily medicated and sedated and hospitalized repeatedly, and electricity and everything. And this went on for many, many, many years of my life. And eventually, they the mental health industry gave up on me in 2010. And then 7 years later, after ending up out on the streets, and finally getting the head injury identified and going through brain rehab, it would be learned in 2017 that I have autism. So the tools that I created in being kind of cast aside by the mental health industry, uh, they were a way that I didn't have any way to understand my experience, and I had tried therapy, logic, social justice, grammar. Um, there were a few others, and they had all failed. They had all not been able to apply to my situation consistently. And when I was looking for a way to survive that experience, I, I stumbled onto a way of looking at my own past with regard to a single word that showed me that there was a part of my mind that is always active, and I believe everyone has this. That's my unique way of seeing and building language. So it's really that was in a trauma state. So in a non-trauma state, I believe an easy way to see how this is demonstrated in for any person is is the story mind. Now, in children, the story mind is the ability to lose oneself in a story, take part in fairy tales and imagination and all that stuff. But it's actually a much, much more powerful mechanism than that, and or can be developed into that as an adult. In the 90s, Robert Bly put out a book called Iron John, in which he did a great deal for the men's movement by sharing ideas about how to take a fairy tale and and use the characters within the fairy tale called Iron John to explore masculine consciousness, archetypal consciousness. And out of that, that was a framework that the archetypal consciousness he got from Dr. Carl Jung, famous psychoanalyst from who gave us basically the theory of the unconscious, the collective unconscious, synchronicity, and just a huge amount of other stuff. He took that idea, he took some Joseph Campbell ideas with fairy tales, and he combined them in this book Iron John, in which he talks about a fairy tale and writes a book about how to make use of the process of the fairy tale to metaphorically explore male consciousness. This is part of how the organization, the Mankind Project, came into being. It's part of what they made use of. It's where a lot in popular culture we have a lot of uh, processes and talk developed about the wild man. Iron John was the original wild man story. So the ability to use a fairy tale to explore male consciousness is a part of this. What I find is that that's actually an innate ability, I believe, of any human being. And I will develop it like this. A story mind as a child is the ability to lose oneself in a story. But a story mind for an adult is so much more powerful because an adult has a lot of social language life developed in their work identity, uh, whatever places they belong to, things they belong to, the bowling league or like a sport you belong to or a church you belong to, like whatever. There are a lot of social language engagements that have language systems associated with them. That's one kind of language. And for anyone who can read a story, the person that one is in a story and identifying with a character and being part of that character's relationship with the story is actually an entirely different mode of consciousness than their everyday consciousness. So even though like in a story you relate to somebody, you know how they feel, and you understand, and you feel for them, and you have empathy, and you relate, that character is entirely different from the life you might live in the outside world. You can still do that. You can still essentially become that character for the purpose of the story. So that means that part of your mind knows how to take on a different identity in a different context and pursue a different purpose and a different life inside the safe confines of a story that doesn't create trauma. It doesn't erase all the machinations that happen in the outside world. It's different, it's other. And there's a part of your mind, if you think about it, you don't disappear as a person when you start reading, when you go into a story. You're still there. It's a continuous process. You come back out of the story, you're still you. If you remember back to a story that you read before, you're still sitting wherever you're sitting remembering. So as we go through adulthood, we could develop a great body of awareness, and part of that awareness is that it is still possible to remember and be actively connected to the stories that we've read before. However, that means that we have a reservoir. We have a reservoir of different ways of life, different identities that worked well in the context of the stories in which we experienced them. And there's a part of us that knows how to go there and access them. And with practice, there's a part of us that can feel how it is to be in that character and what we loved about it without losing track of how we are in the outward life. Um, I really enjoyed trying to think of a character. I really enjoyed the movie Powder, and so many scenes in that broke my heart. And I can remember how it felt to identify with that character without losing connection with the person I am now. So that's what I'm talking about for story mind. It's the ability to effectively to be aware of both in consciousness the outward self and also in consciousness of uh, an alternate version of ourselves that is captured by a story, however we relate to that. Now, actually an incredible flexibility. If you look at how you participate in social things, social situations require a context. Context help people feel safe in acting as if they're all on the same page about what they're doing and what they're doing and why they're doing it. That they're all part of a thing and they're going to go from A to B and get a thing done or maintain a thing or something. They're going to grow something. The point is like there's a we sense. So that's a context. Inside a story, there's no need for loyalty to anything outside the story while you're in it. So that's really fascinating because in the outside world, if you're part of a we context, there's a demand of whoever we are in a functional, whoever I am in a functional context, there's a demand that I remain loyal to the context to help maintain it. I've got to do my part. And then I have my story mind that can take me to how I am in a story that has no loyalty to my outward life. And gets along just fine and still has language and all that stuff. So this demonstrates that a human being has an ability. Something is making that possible. Something is making it possible to be able to be aware, to shift from social life to private story life inside a story and back again, and even notice that we can be both at the same time. Everybody will do this in a unique way, but I believe everybody can do it. So, what does that give us in terms of language and being autistic and being social? Part of the demands of being part of the neurotypical world is that there is an inherent sense of we language. The strategy of the neurotypical world is to act as if many different human beings can share a perception of a common experience. And it's the mentality that we can have a common experience, that there's a we, that there's a we, and that we can have a common experience, and that we can come up with shared language to discuss that common experience, and that we can share the same process of processing that experience so that effectively within a functioning neurotypical context, one person is interchangeable with any other one. And the power of social context is that it makes that work so that it's like seven people solving a problem instead of one. It's a fascinating phenomenon. For me as an autistic person, it's never real. It never was real, but it works for other people, so I try not to decry it. So that comes out of though the language that gets formed in any situation. The way people do that has to come out of their individual perception that they have experiences in common. I have experience going to the grocery store. I have experience putting on my pants. So anyone else who's had experiences that they would frame the same way, that can effectively pretend as if me putting on my pants and them putting on their pants is the same thing, or me going to the store and them going to the store is the same thing, this language tool will work. So it creates a mystique that there's a we. For an autistic person who's born to the blizzard, I never got the luxury of having a lot of experiences that I shared with other people. I never met anyone until I was grown who experienced synesthesia. Didn't know anybody. My base consciousness is unlike anybody that I knew. So I didn't have any way to understand my experiences as someone else's. And because there was no language to sort out the differences and the similarities in the first place, there were no tools to develop a consciousness that I could articulate to someone else to say how I was different. And they had no tools to say how I was the same. It was just a nightmare. But underlying that, I believe, is this phenomenon. If one's individual experiences of life, if a person can't find any way to relate the inner experiences effectively with those around them and apply words to them similarly enough to the people around them in a way that my way of putting words to things matches their way of putting words to things so that the result is relationship, then the context tool fails. There's no way to begin having a we consciousness at all. And the world of language is endless trauma. It was awful. I can't even say. So I kind of looked at life from the outside, and that's what I saw. I saw this kind of mystique. And from my perspective, no two people can ever look at the same thing the same way. that can't ever happen. Since logic only begins with something that's true, anyone who starts in we language loses the right to say that they're being logical because they're starting with something that's false. Nobody ever sees things the same way. No two perspectives are ever identical. That is never a true assumption. So anything that follows from something that was not true in the first place is not logic. Logic has left the building, or Elvis has left the building. So the problem that comes up, as I see it in social language, though, is that because a person who can form that contextual language tool and create group mentalities and participating in a group and relations and systems is that there's no way to practice taking noting any aspect of experience that can't be expressed inside a context. How does this uh, how does this come out in practical terms? My understanding of what a man was as I went into teenage years interfered with my coming out as gay. The effects of trauma in my life created emotions that I did not know how to express and still feel that I was demonstrating what a healthy male was. And those were because there were understandings I had about how to express what a male was in the context of other people that prevented me from seeing how those experiences could be included in the male experience and still result in a healthy expression of myself in relation to other people. So without the ability to take in up an inner experience and express it in language in a way that results in continued or improved social relationships, there's no way to bring those experiences into the language for self-expression. Any experience inside that can't be made to be part of the context that we're comfortable with, a lot of things can happen to them. They can be forgotten entirely, blanked out, denial, or they can be constructed against. They can be repressed. They can be suppressed. Um, all kinds of weird other things can happen, all because of the stress of the demand of honoring one's authenticity and maintaining social language systems through the phenomenon of context. So this came up because last year I saw it came to a head with the racial stuff with the Black Lives Matter movement. But leading up to that, I had met more black men and interacted with them in my dating life, and I'd gone to a talk ostensibly about mental illness in the work of three African American authors: James Baldwin, Richard Wright, and Toni Morrison. Uh, but in all of those situations, the phenomenon of racism has come up, and it came to a head when Black Lives Matter hit the scene, and we had the riots last year and everything. Because I'm in this men's organization, especially for the region I'm in, there are a lot of conservative white men here. And what I saw was a heightened form of something I've seen in the larger society. And it looks to me like this kind of combative thing that never gets resolved. So I don't have any problem feeling like there's things to the black experience of racism that I don't know and can never know, and that I should listen to and not and find a way to make a way for in the world because they have sufferings that I will never have. I can relate to that a little bit by being gay in a largely straight world. But the point was, I looked at the strategy. I started looking, once I knew about my autism, my life got easier. So I started looking at the phenomenon of racism as a social problem, and I started asking myself a different question: is the way that we're approaching it working? So from what I've seen, the primary orientation to a person in dealing with racial justice issues is the belief that if they could get the other person to change how they thought about race or about the problems of race, then we would all come into the same context. We'd be seeing the same problem, and together we'd be one big happy family on the road to solution together. And there's guitars and there's kumbaya and the dancing and all that stuff. That sounded like the mentality. So I asked myself, particularly during this talk, it was a couple of years ago. This is before I ran into the higher problem in the local men's group. I asked myself this question because I'm usually afraid to talk to other people very much. Is what we're doing working? What would be the test to to see if it's working? What would be a practical test? And I had this thought. If our efforts to resolve the race problem in the United States was working, I believe that we would be seeing a reduction in rage among young black men. The reason is because men historically are born into an orientation and raised into an orientation of language in which they are actively encouraged to do something with their feelings other than find words for them. Don't be afraid. Uh, don't be impatient. Don't be angry. Everything about that shuts down a man's active relationship with his feelings. And if he's a kid, he's got to build his language. So he's building his language while being actively encouraged to do something with his feelings other than put them into words. I think that's changing some these days, but as we go back further in time, it was much more strict. So men have no foundation. They have no community for finding words for their feelings. It's a harder thing to process. It makes sense to me logically. They would be the ones that would be the clearest indicator if we were having an effect because they would have the hardest time navigating those stressful feelings. And they would not have the language for it, especially since my understanding is they live in relation to a world that is incredibly hostile to them at every turn. Then if we were actually having an effect, it would be resulting in a level of peace and safety in the black community, which would be affecting these men and they would be having less stress and their amount of rage and frustration would be going down. I approached two of the speakers afterwards. They're both black speakers, and I asked them what they thought, and they said, yeah, they actually agreed with me that that's what we would see, and we are not seeing it. So something wasn't working. So then I have a simple tool that I use very often. If I look at a problem and I apply a tool to the problem that I know works, and the solution doesn't happen, if I know the tool works, I conclude that I misidentified the problem. So that's a subtle point, but how it manifests in race relations is if the assumption that we could educate each other or be educated about race in a dialogical way, if the tool worked, and that's a big if, but let's say it does, because it leads to somewhere, and the result is not the solution that the tool would create, then I must have misperceived the problem. And by that, I conclude that I perceive the problem as being one which applying the tool of education would work. Then I was forced to accept that that was not an effective encapsulation of the problem. So then I started to wonder, like, so we got the problem wrong. The problem uh, is not about needing to educate each other because that makes the assumption that that's a reasonable process towards a solution. We've been trying that since the 60s. Do you think it's working? Because if you're not tired, keep going with that. By all means, you have as much of that as you want. But if you really want to solve it, I would think it'd be better to find out what the problem actually is. So I looked at what the problem might be. And my ticket into this was the first time I heard white fragility, the term white fragility. It was at this talk. And I noticed I'm really sensitive to language, largely because I'm inside. I'm not language based, at least not the way most people are. I noticed the effect of hearing it, and although I understand that the purpose of the term is to talk about observations of the effect of how uh, uh, a white person's ability to deal with certain kinds of change. That's my understanding of it, or be confronted. The effect of being told I have white fragility, the effect, and that's very, very important, not the intention. The effect is that someone else is speaking my truth for me. Someone else is speaking my reality for me. Somehow they are entitled to give words to my inner experience. That's a very important thing. The reason it's important is because whether or not I can overcome that initial response and then engage in a different level in the way that the term is intended, the response is still there. And I began to imagine that maybe what's getting in the way is something I call language trauma. What if the reason social justice initiatives fail largely is because language used to identify social justice issues are created by the disenfranchised and leveled at the perpetrators instead of with the perpetrators. So if someone essentially tells me my business, they may be meaning to convey an idea, but if it hits me as a way of replacing my voice with their understanding for the sake of their agenda, that's a deeper level of engagement, even if it's below consciousness. It produces a trauma. Trauma is more powerful than cognition. And if the trauma is powerful enough, it blocks out cognition. So, however much I might wish to engage in the cognitive discussion about white fragility, if the term being applied to me, being leveled at me, creates enough language trauma, whether I realize it or not, it can actually, to manage my trauma response, my instinctive, you're talking for me, and instead of, like, I didn't agree, I didn't consent to you being able to label my inner experience. If that reaction comes up, it can be so much to manage that there's not enough left over to engage cognitively. Ironically, I believe that the difficulty in doing that, the difficulty in hearing the language, the the fact that trauma is triggered is part of what actually demonstrates white fragility. Um, but so then I began to have this idea that the real reason that social justice initiatives fail is because there's a belief inherent in the tools that we're throwing at it that if I'm trying to make a bridge and they're trying to make a bridge and we use the same words, we assume neurotypically that we're the same people interchangeably looking at the same problem with the same words. Then if we make a bridge across it, that will meet and we'll all be together, big happy family, and the guitars and the kumbaya and everything and the dancing. But that builds in that assumption that from an autistic perspective, that's not actually real. No two people ever see things the same way. So without a way to point out the fact that another person's experience of racism is something I will never understand, and vice versa, without a practical way to honor the difference between us in these discussions, and the unconscious drive, the incessant obsession with establishing a shared perspective, when that might not be possible for everyone involved, the process is doomed to failure. So then I wondered as a white person what I could do perhaps to begin a workaround in this. And although I too had the instinctive reaction, the revulsion of to being labeled with white fragility, which I did not because someone told me specifically me, but because I'm white, it hit me like that. I could manage the language trauma and then disengage that and realize they're not trying to erase my perspective as a white person and then engage in the more cognitive level. But I have tools to deal with language trauma. A lot of men don't. A lot of people don't. So then I began to wonder, like in that space, what could I do if I wanted to take an active role in talks about race, but I don't believe in this. We're going to get a bridge and there's going to be we, big happy family, and the guitars and the kumbaya. And it occurred to me that what would be really helpful was when someone talked to me about racism, to listen past the cognitive meaning of what they say and try to listen inside the words they say to the story that those words came from. So when I listened for someone else's, the trauma in their lives that led them to need to create the words that they are using in the present moment to describe their experience of racism, then I have a chance of hearing them. So it's a harder thing, but if I stop assuming that we're all the same and interchangeable and begin in a place of you have a trauma that I did not understand, and I don't have to, we don't have to merge like a Borg into a single perspective for me to recognize that you have a different understanding of what racism is and not demanding that we have the same perspective. Maybe we have a chance at actually listening to each other, respecting each other's differences, and deciding together what the problem is and how to solve it. Because I understand it's really easy to speak from pain and reactivity and suffering, and I don't disrespect that at all. I just ask if the responses that we've been giving to those pains and sufferings have they been working? Because if they haven't been working, all the suffering in the world doesn't make a tool effective if it's not effective. How does this relate to story mind? The difficulty in what I was suggesting, it amounted to realizing that in a question about race, it was true that even willing participants, they were both talking about race, they were both using language, they could both act as if they were seeing the same problem the same way. But without a way to build in the connection of the people bringing their experiences, their lives, giving rise to the language that they're using to build that bridge, there's no way to see that both sides are building a bridge toward each other and they happen not to be on the same planet. They're on different planets. So if I'm building a bridge west on planet Mars and someone else is building a bridge east on planet Jupiter, we're both building west to east. We're both doing the same task. That bridge will never meet. And it's not any fault with bridges or character or will. It's language. It's contextual blindness. It is a predisposition to be unconsciously loyal to a shared perspective because it feels if your only sense of safety as a human being depends on the context that you're used to, if the contexts fail, it can feel like it's very dangerous. It's out of control. It's horrible. It's essentially a trauma state. So how would we apply story mind to the race problem? I could step out of my reaction to white fragility and begin to imagine that instead of trying to defeat my emotional response, my trauma response, and engage cognitively, I could actually let that conflict go entirely. And instead of trying to agree on them with someone else on language, try to listen inside what they're saying to the pain that gave rise to their language. That was a very, very effective tool, and I felt like I was listening for the first time. And I wasn't listening to try and re-engage in the context or to save anything. I was listening to try to hear the pain that led them to need to speak. And things started to change. My understanding is that the reason I was able to do that is because language box work has allowed me to practice a part of my consciousness that can be inside story and outside story at the same time. So I have a lot of practice in being able to look at any context that I'm used to is essentially a story that I'm used to. The role that I play is essentially a character that has a reality inside that story. But when I practice story mind, I can start to see that I have a life completely outside of those contexts. And with the development of language box work, I can actually cultivate that very well. And that extra experience, that extra grounding outside of all stories, gives me an added touchstone that's uniquely mine. And the benefit of that later is when I find myself engaged in a contextual relationship that's not effective, I don't have to demand that the other person change or that I change or that the context change. I can step out of it entirely and decide on my own independently how I want to take responsibility for my response to the ineffectiveness of the context. That is an immensely more psychologically powerful position to approach any conflict than I've ever found. If I have to solve a game, essentially, if I look at a conflict in a context as a game, if the only way I can deal with context problems, conflict, is by winning or losing, or the thing that always nauseated me, let's agree to disagree. I heard that when I was like 7. My dad said it. I just want to throttle him because it felt to me like he was saying, I don't want to know what's true from you. I just want quiet. I just want the conflict to go away. I think we can do better. And I don't to be fair, the people of the generation before me, they didn't have any of those tools. And they had an even harder situation than I've had. But I'm finding that although the old ways carried us this far, they haven't been able to crack these really hard situations. From what I've been able to observe and experience in dialogues myself about race, it also has happened as a male in talks about feminism, uh, it's happened when I've talked about being gay with straight people. It's really weird. There's kind of this feeling that if someone rejects a language framing that I apply to it, um, it feels like, or if I reject it, we're being disloyal somehow. Instead of finding a voice for like having a way to be part of the situation without being lost in the context of it. So when I see a situation where these tools like white fragility, I could step over my gut reaction, the language trauma of of me feeling like someone else is speaking my truth for me, and participate cognitively or participate transcontextually. But I believe the reason that the barriers are staying up is because there are men that don't have these tools. And for them, when they hear someone using the terms made at them rather than with them, terms that identify them as a problem or as manifesting a problem, which they have no context for in the first place, they're experiencing language trauma that they don't know how to take care of, and it blocks them from having a cognitive response, and it's a stalemate. I have a lot of experience with someone telling me what I meant as an autistic person. I've lived my life in a neurotypical world that had the most bizarre interpretations for my reality, none of which were true, and people that would not listen when I said, not only are you not getting it, you're hurting me. You're erasing me as a person. It was only when I got diagnosed with autism that began to change because I could say, the reason that I'm different from you is not because I'm disagreeing with you, it's because I have autism and I process differently. And that's fine. I get to do that. I get to be different from you. And you don't get to tell me that I'm wrong or sick because of that. So I have a lot of experience with confronting this kind of thing. So then I wonder, actually, I stop wondering why it seems like the conservative white men seem to pull further away from the talks about race and feel as if they're being attacked rather than engaged. In this men's organization, my understanding of it is so that men will find their voices and share them, not that we all have the same voice, but that we create an environment in which men can find their voice and we support each other in finding and expressing it. This is very difficult, and it was very difficult through the BLM crisis because I had a real instinctive reaction when I perceived men, I judged men as not really caring about the plight or not wanting to engage in the conflict or not wanting to say how men play a role in the social problem. But after I ate that initial reflex, I started to see that whatever a man's perspective is, I want him to have a way, I believe, that if we had a way, each of us, to encourage each other to find our own voice for our perspectives on a situation, without the sense that doing so will destroy all of our relationships and our standing and our ability to be safe and happy and grow as people, then we would begin to evolve into a civilization where different perspectives, there was a space for them because we had made a space. The strange and wonderful power of breaking out of the we thinking, the we assumption, and cultivating a resilience outside of context and becoming familiar with an aspect of self that is perfectly capable of surviving changes in context without being lost in trauma, is that over time, my experience with myself at least has been that I believe in myself in a way that I never could before. The world could not give me that. The world can't do what I do. When I look at how another person functions, I I found among men especially that very often they judge themselves in terms of how well they demonstrate their principles, how well they interact cognitively and relationally. I don't really look for that in the healthiness of another man and whether I trust him. The most certain uh, barometer, the most certain measure that I have of whether or not I can trust a man is when I see him exceed his context and have no way to recover it, at least for the time being, and I see how he conducts himself when his understanding fails, because that shows his temperament. And if a man has done enough work that he can surrender his usual ways of thinking, but still have the presence of mind to be aware of the effect he's having on the people around them and how he's conducting himself in terms of his own purpose, his own authenticity, his character, then on such a basis, that man, I believe, can build all the other tools for social engagement. But that foundation is critical. We live in a world in which I see no way for people to develop or cultivate an awareness of themselves with regard to meaning outside of any paradigms. If we're lost in that kind of mentality, where are we going to get the perception that each one of us has an individual perspective that may shed a new light on a situation? The question comes to me that if in our evolving civilization and our advancing civilization, what if the problems we face are actually too complex for that narrow way of thinking to solve them? What if the complexity of our problems, without any of us meaning to or imagining it, are such that we will not make a way through unless we find ways for people to share their individual perspectives? If that's the case, then I see no way forward without individual people being able to develop some consciousness that's not in trauma when they're inside or outside of context. If I have an understanding that I lose in some situation and the losing of that context puts me in so much of a trauma state that I'm violent and hasty and hurt people and take rash actions because I'm reactive rather than responsive, how do we hope to build a better world? If the world is whipping into a frenzy that paradigmatic mind, and we don't cultivate something else, if we so that's why I talk about story mind. The fact that children can engage in play and imagination and stories demonstrates that we had it as kids. The fact that we can read a book or identify with a news story or history or anything demonstrates that we could take part in a context other than our immediate present one. That demonstrates that something in us is able to do that. And it's not the context of right now, our present immediate situation, and it's not the context in the story either. It's something between the two. So that's how I see story mind. That's how I see that it could be very useful, both in individual development and in using that extra awareness to participate in the social problems of our days. If I can hear another person and not only be listening for how to preserve the context of my emotional safety and context and my role and my standing, I'm not trying to win or lose. If I can listen without having to do everything I can to protect myself and the way I've understood things so that I have enough response left over to listen inside what you say to the pain that led you to need to say it and hear that and not erase it and not recontextualize it, but let it touch me and relate to the feelings of it as my individual authentic self. I believe that whatever I respond to when that happens will be informed by my authenticity and the authenticity of the other person. And I believe that when we start approaching the issues of our days in a state where we are listening as our authentic selves and hearing the other person as their authentic selves, whether we contextualize it at the time or not, we'll do the group thing later. Then we begin to have a shot at bringing the human power that we need to truly crack the problems we face and emerge into human adulthood. So that's my talk, and thanks for another go around in the language box perspective. I hope you enjoyed it. Leave comments if you like, and we'll see you next time.